This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Well, thank you very much. My first visit, I believe, to Pensacola was to learn how to survive a dunker. And it was an interesting exercise, as I recall. And then we came down for helicopter training. It turns out that none of the astronauts, Apollo astronauts, had ever flown helicopters. And so everybody, including the professional pilots, came down here for training. And my instructor, somehow or another, connived to be my instructor because his last name was Schmitt, spelled the same way. He was later on a very active helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and has since written several books about that experience. I should also mention that the quote about being the only natural scientist in the United States Senate since Thomas Jefferson has to be attributed to my then colleague Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who not only was a historian, but never failed to remind people of that fact. And every time I would walk onto the Senate floor for whatever reason, and if Senator Moynihan happened to be there, he would interrupt all the proceedings, ask for recognition, and say exactly what Ken just said. And that went on for 6 years. Today, I want to first of all talk about a little bit of history, then give you a very quick review on what the Apollo 17 mission was like. Some of you, I'm sure, were here when I talked about that before. And then talk a little bit about how, what are some of the essential elements, I believe, necessary if we're really serious about undertaking a return to the moon and using that experience again then to go on to Mars and to have an indefinite presence in deep space. As I look around, I have a feeling most of you are quite familiar with the history of Apollo, but let's do a quick review. And that was not intended to be pejorative at all. You know, a lot of people don't recognize that Dwight D. Eisenhower laid the groundwork for Apollo, put the foundations in place that made it possible to undertake it, at least in the time frame that existed at the time. He not only, as Supreme Commander of our forces in Europe, sent two captains to bring von Braun out of Europe, along with a number of rockets and and as many of his personnel as they could rescue. That had an awful lot to do with the ultimate development of the Saturn V. But he also, in 1960, January of 1960 to be specific, sent T. Keith Glennon, the then administrator of NASA, a directive by letter to begin the development of the super booster, which became the Saturn V. And that clearly was the enabling technology that made it possible and won the space race and made it possible for us to go to the moon. Over a year before Kennedy issued his challenge, we were well on our way, at least with that booster technology, to being prepared. We didn't know how to do it yet, but still, you know, engineers, they're confident they can do anything if you just describe what it is you want to do. Now, the Russian, then Soviet challenge was well recognized. Landing on the moon was proposed by President Kennedy to counter their advances in human spaceflight. We have to remember the whole impetus was geopolitical. It was a major competition within the Cold War, and its success really had a great deal to do with a loss of confidence in the Soviet Union. Immigrants have verified that on many occasions. And that contributed to the ultimate demise of the Soviet Union. Now, John Glenn orbited the Earth in February of 1962. I was privileged to serve with John in the Senate while I was there. Apollo 8 orbited the moon 50 years ago this December. Hard to believe. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders are in the process of celebrating that event. Neil Armstrong, though, successfully landed on the moon July 20th, 50 years next year, and that effectively, in most history books, ended the moon race. Actually, the moon race ended, as far as the Soviets were concerned, as I understand, again from immigrants, when we successfully launched the Saturn V the first time. They did not have a moon rocket. We did, and it was pretty clear what was going to happen downstream. Even though it may not have been clear to everybody else, it seemed to be clear to them. Now, there were 5 additional Apollo missions between November 1969 and 1972. Each one of those had longer and longer time on the moon. But the last 3 actually had what was called the Block 2 lunar module. And we had the opportunity for 3 excursions, each one 7 to 7.5 hours long. So really things matured very, very rapidly, thanks primarily to the foresight of George Low, who was the Apollo spacecraft program manager at, excuse me, at the Manned Spacecraft Center then, now the Johnson Spacecraft Center. George also was responsible for conceiving of and persuading NASA senior managers, to undertake the Apollo 8 mission. Somehow that tends to get lost, but it was his idea, and it was his persuasion that made that event happen 50 years ago. Apollo 13, as you I'm sure recall, and many of you, hope you all have seen the movie. It was a very fine movie, should have won an Academy Award, but politics, I think, raised its ugly head. But it was damaged by an explosion in April of 1970, and the crew survived that, and that's what they had to do, was survive. But most of the work was done by people in Mission Control Center, young people, and the average age of those young people was 25 years old, 26, 25. And they had already flown several missions out of Mission Control. So these kinds of efforts require young people. They really do. The courage, the imagination, the patriotism, the stamina that they have is absolutely essential. And that is obviously true in our own defense establishment. And they deserve all the credit and thanks that we can give them. The last 3 Apollo missions explored different areas of the moon, developed through all 6 missions that landed on the moon. We brought back 850 pounds of moon rocks and soil. And it is clearly the gift that keeps on giving as analytical technology matures and advances. We can go back to the samples that we've already analyzed and find out new things about them. It's really quite remarkable. And from that, on the science side, which was not intended to be a significant part of the Apollo program, but became that, again, due to people like George Low, there's been a great new understanding of the early history of the Earth, because the moon has recorded that history and it hasn't been erased. On Earth, it was obviously recorded, but it's been largely erased because of the tremendous geological dynamics of our planet. Now, just to put this all in perspective, I don't think there's anybody here that remembers this flight. I may look like I did, but I didn't. But in December 1903, of course, we had the first flight of the Wright brothers aircraft. And it was by May of 1961, John Kennedy had the confidence, based on the confidence that NASA's engineers gave him, to challenge us to go to the moon. And in December of 1969, that was done. And that challenge was met. Now, this quote from Wernher von Braun, I think, is very important. And we have to remember it as we go into the future. I've learned to use the word impossible with the greatest caution. For those of you that know about Robert Goddard and his experiments in my home state of New Mexico, just to give you an idea how even how much things changed and how fast they changed, his crawler, if you will, is on the left, and the crawler that took the Saturn V's out to the launch pad is on the right. I just like this picture. Mike Collins, Neil Armstrong, and Buzz Aldrin, the Apollo 11 crew, here are looking very serious, including Ken Mattingly and myself and everybody else in Mission Control Center. And as near as I can tell, what we're concerned about is waiting for acquisition of signal from the Apollo 8 spacecraft as it came out of lunar orbit. That was the key element of that mission, is that they indeed, the rocket engine and the command and service module fired on time, and that they were headed back on a trajectory to return home. That was the Christmas mission, as you may recall. And that happened right on the second it was supposed to. The viewing room behind Mission Control, you can just see some of the windows back there, was absolutely packed, as you might imagine. Same thing happened, of course, with Apollo 10. It went into orbit around the moon. They had their own firing behind the moon. That viewing room was essentially empty. You know, we're strange people, we Americans. You know, same risks, everything was the same, except, hey, we've done that. And so we're going to wait for, we're going to do something else instead of watch that coming about. Well, the Saturn system is all illustrated here, including spacecraft up on the mark. This is a rollout of the Apollo 17 Saturn from the Vehicle Assembly Building down at the Kennedy Space Center. And for size perspective, down in the lower right there is a large fire truck. At the time this building was built by the Corps of Engineers, it was the largest enclosed space in the world. That's changed. The Mall of America, I think, exceeded it at first. And then I believe that there's an aircraft assembly plant in South Carolina, building 787s, that now it has that distinction. But I haven't researched it, so I'm happy to be corrected. Our launch, shown here, was at night. It was, I understand, quite spectacular. I happened to miss that one. And if you look carefully, if you can see, I don't know whether we want to turn off these lights up here or not, but it'll take a little bit of that light off there you go. You see there's some bright spots on the left of the rocket. Those are large chunks of frost coming off the rocket. We had to sit on the launch pad for about 2 hours and 40 minutes after our scheduled liftoff because of a computer misunderstanding. Computer thought a tank in the rocket had not been pressurized, but somebody had pressurized it when the computer didn't. But the computer was looking at whether a signal had been sent rather than whether it had been acted upon. Just a little lesson of garbage in and garbage out. But also, because of the nature of computers in those days, that problem was solved with a shunt. They actually wired around the terminals in the computer, so it just told the computer, that shunt told the computer that the tank was pressurized, okay? So ignore it. So we got off after they had convinced management, of course, that they knew what they were doing. That took most of that 2 hours and 40 minutes. Now, our spacecraft included, of course, the Command and Service Module America and the Lunar Module Challenger in the lower right. They were all tucked away up in the top of that rocket. That rocket developed 7.5 million pounds of thrust. weighed 6.8 million pounds fully fueled. And even though it put 44 metric tons on a trajectory to the moon, you don't get much out of all of that. And one of the current astronauts has a great presentation, Ken, we probably ought to get him down here to give it, about that if the Earth was just slightly bigger, we couldn't use chemical propulsion to get off of it. And we would be confined to developing some kind of a nuclear propulsion system in order to do it. So we're very fortunate that the Earth is just the right size. And there it is. This picture was taken from about 34,000 miles away as part of my documentation of weather patterns that I was describing for 3.5 days on the way to the moon. I grew up as a son of an amateur meteorologist, namely my father, who was actually a geologist. And we tried to forecast and, of course, predict weather patterns in southern New Mexico throughout my childhood. And so when I knew I was going to have 3.5 days going to the moon, I said, well, I ought to expand that amateur meteorology bent and see if I couldn't observe and predict weather patterns in the southern hemisphere, which you see here, largely the southern hemisphere. In the upper right of this picture, there's a large typhoon or hurricane going ashore on the subcontinent of India. The intertropical convergence zone, of course, is nicely shown around the equatorial regions. But the nice thing about the southern hemisphere is there are not very many continental masses, and so you get these very systematic fronts moving out of Antarctica, turning into circulation patterns that you see there and circulating around their home. Now, where we were headed for Apollo 17 is this edge of a basin called the Serenitatis Basin, about 740 kilometers in diameter. And relative to the Apollo 11 landing site, it was about 600 kilometers north and somewhat more to the east. So it was in a different part of the moon, one of the most complicated areas we could find, the idea being that, well, Schmitt, if you're such a great geologist, we'll send you to as complicated a place as we can find and see if you can answer some of the questions that are bugging us related to the samples and the observations that had already been made. If you look very carefully, more or less in the center of the picture, there is a spacecraft. That's the command and service module. Ron Evans, our command module pilot, is alone in that picture when this picture was taken. And he is performing what was called landmark tracking, first put together by Jim Lovell and myself for the Apollo 8 mission. And this was something that turned out to be very important for our pinpoint landings, on the moon, more or less pinpoint landings on each of the future missions. The idea was that if you track small craters on the surface of the moon, the position of which you know relative to the center of mass of the moon, based on earlier spacecraft tracking, then you could tie that back and give your lunar module a better idea of where or better knowledge of where the landing site was. And this was extremely important for us because landing in that narrow valley, that you see there is only about 7 kilometers wide. And we were going to land more or less right in the center of it. And I'll show you where. Now in the lower right, there's a bright spot, white spot. That is our landing site. And you might ask yourself, why is it bright? Now this picture was taken just a couple years ago by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is in orbit around the moon today, taking extremely high resolution photographs from a wide variety of different angles. This happens to be what we call an oblique photograph. And it has photographed not only our landing site, but all the other 5. And the reason that bright spot is there is because the descent engine effluents have winnowed away fine particles which are somewhat darker than the coarse particles. And it gives you that high contrast that you see in this picture. Now, also this picture shows the scar from an avalanche of dust that came off the side of the South Massif there on the left. And our excursions took us over to the base of that massif and crossed the avalanche, and we gained a great deal of information, not only about avalanches on the moon, but about the volatile materials that allow them to be fluidized, like snow avalanches are here on Earth. One of the many things that came out of that, of our 3 days on the moon. The Challenger, of course, is right where I indicated it was. Now, this is a picture that we had before we went to the moon. Not nearly the resolution, the identifying resolution. This picture is probably about 15 meters, whereas you'll see in a moment, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter gives us identifying resolutions much less than a meter. This picture was taken by the Apollo 15 mission as it flew over the valley of Taurus-Littrow, which was to become our landing site. And this is a Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter picture of our landing site. That's the Challenger descent stage. Sitting there in the center of the picture, the lunar rover is parked off to the right there. This was taken about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And you even can see our tracks of our rover if you look carefully. Now, the rover wheels are only about that wide, so you can see what the resolution of these pictures are. Really quite remarkable. In the far left of the picture is the area where I deployed the Apollo lunar surface science package, and actually laid out, if you look very carefully, you'll see a partial cross there, and that's a geophone line for some active seismic work that we also did. First view I had, however, going back in time quite a bit, was this out of the lunar module's right-hand window, looking towards the North Massif, the north wall of the valley. That the base of that massif is probably about 3.5 miles away from where we landed. Now, I should apologize right now. You'll hear me use different units, and that's fortunate we never got them confused in flight. But the reason for different units coming up is that we built all of our spacecraft and rockets and everything using the English system of measure. The engineers preferred that at the time. We flew them using a nautical system of measure, navigated in nautical miles, and we worked on the moon largely in the metric system of measure. And so every once in a while I'll slip and go back and forth between them. The bright object in the foreground there is one of 16 small rockets with only 50 pounds thrust that we use to control the attitude of our spacecraft in flight. And I just will draw your attention to compare that 50-pound thrust with that rocket with the 1.5 million pounds of thrust in the F1 engines of the first stage of the Saturn V, and you see the spectrum of propulsion technology that was developed in order to successfully go to the moon. The third spacecraft we had really was this spacesuit. It had all the aspects of a spacecraft. It had you survive in it for about 8 to 8.5 hours. So it had plenty of oxygen and cooling water. It, of course, provide the pressure environment in which you could breathe, and you had to provide the mobility, which was fine. And it really, for that time, was an excellent spacesuit. I would hope that we improve on that significantly in the future. We have probably not put the kind of resources into spacesuits that we should. And in particular, building suits of materials that either actively or passively can reject dust. Because when future astronauts on the moon go into their habitat, if you use these kind of materials, you're going to bring a lot of dust in the habitat. And that's probably not a good idea. having inhaled lunar dust 4 different times while I was there, it didn't seem to bother me, although other people say maybe it did. It smells like gunpowder, by the way, and it's just activated, very fine dust. And as soon as we took our helmets off, everybody had the same reaction. Yep, smells like gunpowder. And I think there are plenty of engineering solutions to keep dust out of the habitats, but one of the best is to not bring the suits into habitat or have suits that reject dust. And I think we need to work on both of those solutions. This is the large boulder that we investigated that we had seen, one of the few boulders we could see on those pre-mission photographs. It had rolled down the side of the north wall of the valley, the North Massif, and it left a boulder track, so we know where it came from. And that's one of the best ways for geologists to explore the mountains of the moon, is to go where the boulders have left tracks and sample the boulders. It's a lot easier than climbing up those mountains in that suit, believe me. It's hard to tell here, but the slope that I'm on here and the rover over there on the right is about a 20-degree slope. Behind this picture, the slope goes up to about 26 degrees. And the boulder fell apart when it hit that change in slope. It broke up into 5 different pieces, 2 of which you can see in this picture. I'm just there for scale of this. Now, there's been a lot of talk about there's no color on the moon. I just want to show you that there is. You may have heard about the orange soil. And this is almost exactly what I saw when I discovered that orange soil and dug a trench in it. A colleague of mine, Ron Wells, a retired astronomer from, pardon the expression, Berkeley, he and his son are really outstanding in processing images, and they just adjusted the color balance in these pictures. There's not any enhancement in that sense, but the colors are all there. You just have to change the balance. And NASA, when they originally printed these pictures or developed these pictures, did not actually try to get the color balance. But I had described what the color was, namely that it was the same color as a decal I had on the camera on my chest. And that was the control that was used in order to produce these pictures. And that's exactly what I was seeing. Somewhat red in the core and orange to yellow on the sides. It just really, this is exactly right. So you can see that at least there is color. What is it? It's volcanic ash. And its color is because of the titanium iron ratio. It's a high titanium glass, and it has, that produces that color. There are green glasses that were sampled by Apollo 15 that didn't quite get the notoriety that this did, because we didn't recognize what they had done. And that's why you want a geologist on every one of these missions. That green glass is a low titanium glass, so that's what affects the color, and that's been shown experimentally as well. Well, it's time to return, folks. And fortunately, the Vice President and the President have agreed with that. It is not entirely clear NASA has agreed with that yet, but hopefully they will as time progresses here. If you're going to return, you're going to need just about what we had, hopefully with longer stay times and more modern equipment, but we had a place to live, namely the lunar module. We had a transportation system, the lunar rover, and we had that spacecraft from work on the surface that I mentioned, the spacesuit. And of course, you need the support of the American taxpayer, as symbolized by the flag. Now, you can see yours truly and others enjoying the President signing the directive that hopefully has set us back on a course to the moon and on to Mars. There is a geopolitical imperative to doing that, just like there was for Apollo, maybe is equally as urgent if it's finally recognized. We need to understand that imperative and educate others on the critical nature being dominant in space, that liberty and freedom have called us to this task again. And science will benefit from this, but the primary driver, I think, is to ensure that liberty is protected in space as in the same way that we try to protect it here on Earth. And to do that, we're going to have focus. Apollo was an extraordinarily focused program, as you may recall. The management environment as well as the technical innovation environment was just unbelievable. It was a young person's program for the most part, and it had adequate funding in order to make these things happen. That has to happen again, and management of NASA, or whomever is responsible for this, must focus on it with a single-mindedness that Apollo had. I want to mention this question of adequate reserves. So those of you who have been involved in major programs of any kind know how important it is to have the reserves necessary to deal with those unknown unknowns, the unkunks, that invariably come along in complex programs. The near demise of the space shuttle and the cancellation of Constellation were all related to this. Apollo's reserves were around 100%. And the reason for that was that the administrator, Kennedy's administrator of NASA, James Webb, asked his engineers, I'm sorry about that automated change there, asked them what they thought the Apollo meeting Kennedy's challenge would cost. And they came in around, in those year dollars, around $8 billion. Well, Webb, when he went to Congress and to the Office of Management and Budget, said $16 billion in those year dollars. And that gave us about 100% reserve, and we used it all. How did we use it? We used it to deal with those unknown unknowns that came up. We had parallel design efforts for critical systems so that if one didn't work out, we could move over to the other one, and that was done on several different occasions. And today, I think we could probably take that down to about 30%. Because we're smarter. We're a lot smarter than we were. But I think it's absolutely necessary to have that reserve. If you don't have it, you're not going to make your milestones, and you're going to gradually lose political support. And so you'll hear me talking about adequate reserves on many different occasions. The funding also generally has to be stable. And that was only going to come if we as a nation make a commitment to the indefinite occupation, if you will, the indefinite exploration of deep space, ultimately to the occupation of the moon, I think. And that requires that we be competitive in space. Our competitors here on Earth are working very, very hard to displace us in space. And we have to work even harder in order to maintain the edge. And if you want to have a constitutional justification for all of this, it really is national security. Space is a major part of that, both technically and psychologically, as was demonstrated in spades by Apollo. And we have to stay young. I'm not showing this to show how young I was at one time, but that's extremely important. Average age during Apollo of both the contractor personnel and NASA personnel was in the 20s. Average age of middle managers were in the 30s. And in order to do that now, we're going to have to adopt the best of military and civil service rules so that NASA can stay young. Right now, they can't stay young. They're about twice the age of what NASA was in Apollo. And it just has to work. The military is able to stay young. They have to stay young. One of the best examples of that, of course, is the nuclear Navy. And they have a system by which they enforce younging across the Navy. And technical currency and flexibility is going to be extremely important. We don't want to reach so far that unnecessary technical risk is assumed. However, design for continuous production and upgrades in technically fluid fields, and actually most fields are technically fluid nowadays, is extremely important. Physics changes slowly. It does change, as you may be aware, but engineering can change overnight. And I just draw your attention to the changes we've seen in just a few years in computation, in the use of composite materials. 3D printing is now just exploding. And there's there are materials, and I'll use one example, and that's something called graphene. The physicists don't really understand graphene, but it has unbelievable properties for doing things with very lightweight materials. Graphene is just a single layer of carbon atoms that is, I think, going to revolutionize all sorts of areas in engineering, and many of which we don't know about yet. Need to maintain internal agency and corporate engineering design strength. It's one thing to contract, it's another thing to be able to manage and oversee those contracts and to have a diversity of opinion when you hit a problem on what the problem is and how to solve it. Also, we need to have an open management environment, minimize layers of decision making. During Apollo, a good idea to solve a problem or to enhance a capability could come up with in one day, be matured overnight, and reach it to a management decision the next day, literally. And the best illustration of that is just how quickly good ideas could rise from any level within the organization, because there weren't many levels. And for a while we avoided decision creep. I began to, when I went to NASA headquarters for a couple of years to manage their energy programs, I discovered that decision creep had already raised its ugly head in NASA. To get a letter out of my office signed by the administrator to some other agency head or something, I had to get 14 signatures. It's worse, it's far worse now. And people just are passing the buck upwards until all decisions are being made at the top. You got to get rid of that. Have to get rid of that. Risk management has to be embedded at all levels of implementation. You've got to identify the major risks and manage their mitigation, prepare in advance for the responses, and design and train intensively, as like the military pilots have always said, design and train as close to possible how you would fly. All of that was something we did in Apollo and has to come back into a program for returning to the moon. I'm very committed to this concept of managing the critical paths to success. They need to be under United States control in order to make the milestones necessary to success and to guarantee stable funding. Strong leadership will open opportunities for international partners to utilize, but international partners and commercial partners other than contractors being managed by NASA should not be in the critical path to success. If you're really serious about going back to the moon and on to Mars, you're going to have to manage it in that way, in my opinion. Skill requirements must drive diversity. I feel that the stakes are too high in space to let political correctness drive diversity. You'll have plenty of diversity within the team if you are looking for skills. One of the things that has to be done, and we've really lost control of, and that is to develop the farm team, and that's STEM education. I know that's a very active area of activity in Pensacola. It must be nationwide, and STEM, I think, includes a whole bunch of other things. It includes critical thinking, it includes history, just a number of other things. But we have to gain control of our education system again. We really do. That's the farm team. And I'm I'll leave it up to you to figure out how to do that. I have plenty of ideas on how it might be done. Private investment has long been a part of aerospace. Entrepreneurial activity in the aircraft industry. Some of you are old enough to remember that North American and other companies, the old Lockheed used to design and build airplanes and then sell them to the military. Now they wait for the military to ask for an airplane. Entrepreneurial activity was always part of it and should be, and now is growing again, thanks to the funding of some people who have funds that they want to use in this endeavor. Satellite communications are often forgotten as as one of the major private sector activities in space. It is entirely private. Clearly, the government sometimes is a customer, but it is almost entirely private. So private space has been very active. Contractor teams implemented most of Apollo. Very little government supplied equipment, GFE, furnished equipment, but most of it was by contractors. It requires very strong oversight. Now, there's a new era, as we've indicated, of entrepreneurial investment. And they are, in fact, applying many of the lessons of Apollo. In particular, they have attracted and are trying to maintain young people in their core operations. And they have the management reserves, at least some of them do, that can deal with those unknown unknowns that we talked about. Lunar resources that are going to be necessary to go on to Mars and also to support permanent settlements on the moon and other activities in space, and maybe even energy production here on Earth in the long term through that helium-3 fusion that Ken mentioned. That is probably best done by private entities. The government's not very good at doing that kind of thing, and history has shown us. And so I would suggest that we work out how that is going to be done by the private sector. What's my conclusion for all of this? Well, first of all, it's no luck. It's no accident, our luck, that Apollo was successful. The management team, the environment that developed, particularly immediately after the fire in which we lost Gus Grissom and his crew, was a very, very successful management system. It enabled a Saturn-class mission every 2 months between November of 1968 and November of 1969. Unbelievable that we did that. And now we're looking at maybe having an SLS launch every 2 years. So something's got to change if we expect to be competitive in deep space. We don't want to reinvent the past, but we certainly can learn from it. The physics of spaceflight won't change, but if the concepts we used in the past worked, let's modernize them and use them again. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. All right, we're going to throw microphones at you, so be ready. Right here, first hand.
Just hold it down.
Okay. Thank you for taking my question. As I understand it, there's an experiment still going on left by LLRs on the moon, which is lunar laser reflectors, where they fire a laser at the reflector, and they've recorded that the moon is moving away from the Earth at about 1.5 inches per year. If this is true, and we can reverse that calculation, in 1.5 billion years, the moon would be touching the Earth. So that brings the question of the age of the Earth and the moon. Do you have any response to that?
Well, that motion, yes, that motion away from the Earth probably started very early. in an accelerated way, and then because of tidal forces. The tidal forces were much stronger early on than they were later. So it may have even, that calculation may even be smaller than it should have been. I have not heard an explanation for that. Now, my own feeling is that the moon did not form as a result of a giant impact, which is the prevailing opinion of most of my colleagues. I think it accreted independently and was captured. And that would be more consistent with what you just described. The capture was maybe 1 billion years ago rather than having formed at this, as a result of this giant impact. There are a lot of reasons to, I think, to doubt the giant impact, not the least of which is the evidence from that orange ash that you saw in that picture, which has a high concentration of volatile elements in it that we don't see near the surface of the moon. So there are reservoirs of these volatile elements deep within the moon, and that so far is incompatible with the kind of modeling that's been done in order to support the giant impact hypothesis. So I think the question you ask, which is why if you calculate backwards, the Earth would be much closer to the moon would be much closer to the Earth, may relate to that, again, to that deeper and bigger controversy over the origin of the moon itself. Now, the moon and the Earth have essentially identical isotopic compositions. So however it happened, there had to be mixing of some kind. That mixing may have occurred in what we call the feeding zone around the sun, where both planets evolved. And in that feeding zone, you would expect to have identical isotopic compositions. They would vary radially from the sun, but within a given feeding zone, they would be essentially identical. But to 6 decimal places, for example, the oxygen isotopes are identical, the ratios of isotopes. And that's another reason why I don't think the moon occurred by a giant impact. But that's an excellent question. Right here, and then there's some back over. Okay.
Will the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese get to Mars first, or will private interests?
I think that the certain entrepreneurs that think that Mars can be done in a couple of years may be smoking something that they shouldn't. Mars is going to be very tough. Not only getting there, you have to deal with the radiation environment. Now, the solar radiation environment can probably be dealt with a shell of water. Now, you have to have the water. It's massive, and the moon is probably the best way to get it, best place to get it. But the proton and electron radiation from the sun and X-ray radiation, you can probably deal with a fairly thin shell, a few inches of water. Galactic cosmic rays or something else. And in fact, we had an experiment on Apollo 17 where we actually watched galactic cosmic rays create brimstone radiation in our vitreous humor of our eyes. And it's something the earlier astronauts had noticed and commented on, and we actually did an experiment where we obviously put up shades, turned out all the lights, put on a mask, and let our eyes dark adapt. And going out towards the moon, you could see these fireworks in your eyes, and they're really quite spectacular. The interesting thing is, for those of you who might be interested in that subject, coming back, we did an identical experiment, saw nothing. And at the time, and we were talking about a little bit this today, at the time, the idea that I heard was that these rays should be coming from all directions. Isotropic is the word we use. And clearly, they were not isotropic for us. We didn't see them coming back. So they're coming from they have a directionality to them that I have not heard, and I haven't pursued it, and I should, but I haven't pursued it to try to find out what the current thinking is about that. But Mars is going to be tough. Not only tough getting there and dealing with the physiological issues of getting there, I think we can deal with those. I think exercise and some other techniques, some of which are being worked on here at IHMC, will enable us to deal with the physiological side of long-duration spaceflight. Galactic cosmic rays, I don't know how we deal with those yet, unless we can develop kind of energy sources for our spacecraft, like fusion energy sources that can give you enough of a magnetic field around the spacecraft to divert those cosmic rays. But they're extremely high energy. They're iron. They're atoms. Atomic weight of iron are more. And they're coming very fast. But landing on Mars, we don't have to do that yet. There's quite a number of constraints. One is there's just enough atmosphere to bother you and not enough to help you. It doesn't take very long from the time you start to enter the Martian atmosphere until you're on the surface. It's like in the order of a minute, or depending on how you design the trajectory. We spent the better part of 10 minutes landing on the moon, so we had a lot of time to deal with that. Maybe more importantly, you're not going to have any help. The crews are on their own, and everything has to be designed either to be automated, or the crews have to have all the information they need in order to land, because mission control isn't going to be there to help you. The communication delay varies from 8 minutes to 40 minutes, if I remember correctly. So the Earth is going to be a great data processing and planning planet in the sky, but it's not going to help you much in what we call real time. In fact, it won't help you at all. So we need to learn how to do those things, and the moon's the best place to learn to do those. There's some, just because you go there and you work in deep space, you're only 3 days away from Earth rather than 9 months, or you simulate things in order to learn how to operate in space. You've got to remember, there's not a generation on Earth that has dealt with the risk of deep space. I mean, that generation's barely here anymore. And so we have to train multiple generations over time to think about how do you mitigate, how do you manage those risks of deep space. And they're unique. They're not the same as working in Earth orbit. Earth orbit has now become pretty much an accessible, not a part of our human activities, not without its own risks, but nevertheless, it's much more accessible than it was at the time of Apollo. Deep space hasn't changed. It's still going to be tough, and Mars will be one of the toughest things we ever do, for some of the reasons that I've given. Another question? This lady here.
Were you able to discern the age of that avalanche?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we were. It's somewhere between 75 and 100 million years. And actually, it's on top of an older avalanche. It's probably about twice as old. We didn't know that. When I go back and look at the old pictures, I say, yeah, right, we should have known that. But it wasn't until we got these fantastic variety of images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that we could see that there's an older avalanche deposit underneath the younger one. So there were two of them. And they may have been activated by a fault, what we call a thrust fault, where rocks will be pushed over that way. The moon is contracting now. It's cooling enough that it's contracting, and every once in a while it'll give you these thrust faults, and we're starting to understand that much more now than as a result of LRO images than we did before. But we actually studied one of those in the valley, where it goes right across the valley, one of those thrust faults. And it may be that the thrust faults are periodically active, and they are triggering those avalanches, at least the one that we studied.
We have time for one more question.
Do we have any young, really young person here that wants to? How about this young man here?
All right, thank you, sir. You stated during your presentation that NASA's reaction after the Apollo 1 fire helped Apollo succeed. How does that differ to NASA's reaction after Columbia and Challenger that crippled and almost killed the space shuttle program?
Well, for one thing, the Apollo effort had a very strong geopolitical impetus behind it. There was bipartisan support for it and politically. The shuttle has not had that. It did not have that. Secondly, the reaction to the Apollo 1 fire was immediate. The NASA reorganized itself at the top, pretty much, and put together teams that became very active right away to deal with both understanding why we had the fire and then what needed to be done about it. In fact, that process had begun before the fire. The management already knew that there were problems with the design of that spacecraft, and with all of the waivers that had been given for flammable materials, for the use of glycol in the cooling system and things like that, all of which probably contributed to the deadly nature of that fire. That work was already underway in a Block 2 command and service module design. And Frank Borman led George Low's team that went out to, that's what brought George Low into the management position that he had, was the fire. Joe Shea was replaced. And Borman was Low's man in California, and there was an energy behind the reaction to that that you didn't see in NASA management with respect to the shuttle accidents. In fact, after the first one, NASA sat on their hands for about a week, and you ended up with a commission and that was a mistake. And we always had, in the early days, what was called the Blue Book, as I recall, on the shelf, which is what you do in case of a major accident. And you should pull that off and implement the plan that has been put together in a much more benign environment than comes after an accident. And unfortunately, the NASA administrator at that time did not implement it and did not get going fast enough. Whether it would have made any difference or not, you can't run two experiments, but it still should have been done in a much more vigorous way than it was.
On that cautionary note, let's thank our speaker.